So hopefully that was helpful. I know if you haven't had a chance to look at the tool yet, obviously some of that would be a little bit confusing, but just know that the tutorial is posted online as well. So if you do have any confusion and need to revisit it, you can always go take a look at that as well. So the learning objectives for day 3, first and foremost, to understand the purpose of the SRA and its role in the seafood industry, and to gain an understanding of the concepts covered in the context of the fishing sector, and then also kind of how these concepts are covered by the risk assessment framework based on the 3 pillars of the Monterey framework. So these are the principles of the SRA. So starting off with an introduction to the SRA itself, hopefully you've had an introduction to it, you've seen it before, you know something about it, but just at a high level here. Um, so the SRA is a social risk assessment framework for the seafood industry, and that's really important to understand because it's not a certification, which means that it translates information in a different way. So whereas a Fair Trade USA or an RFBS will give you a badge of honor at the end for completing all of the courses, or completing all the courses by showing compliance against all of their chosen requirements. The SRA was really meant to encompass kind of all topic areas of social responsibility. So where a standard might be focused in one particular area and have a very direct, narrow focus, the SRA itself is able to cover everything because it's really just a risk assessment. So, you know, and as an open access tool, it can really be used in a number of different ways. So it can be used to help inform a human rights due diligence process. It can be part of an actual step in the human rights due diligence process. You can implement the full SRA. You can take a staggered approach to implementation of the SRA. You can, you know, build a whole program around it. And, you know, through and through, it's not just a pass fail. So I'll talk a little bit more about the value on the next slide here. But the SRA was developed by Conservation International and was developed off of what's known as the Monterey Framework. So this was research that came out of Conservation International that was seeking to find a common definition for social responsibility that was holistic and covered multiple different areas of social responsibility in seafood. So what that looks like is first and foremost kind of your individual rights, so protecting human rights, dignity, and access to resources. So these are your core ILO core ILO conventions, for example, and kind of these baseline minimum requirements for individual well-being and really affect an individual. Then you have ensure equality and equitable opportunity to benefit. These are partially collective and also partially individual rights here. So these are things that kind of go a little bit far and beyond. And these are things based on, for example, equal pay, equal opportunity to access a fishery, customary use rights, and in particular as well, engagement with workers, primarily around a grievance mechanism. And then principle 3 here is improve food and livelihood security. So in order to be, you know, truly sustainable fishery, thinking to the sustainable development goals, for example, food and livelihood security are 2 really key components there to, you know, understanding human rights and social responsibility in seafood supply chains. So this whole principle is really focused on making sure that people are healthy and making sure that they have, you know, their livelihoods are protected if their livelihoods are reliant on the fishery, whether that's the unit of assessment itself or the fishery that they're operating on or competing resources with. So the development of the SRA was a really rigorous process. It was developed in alignment with international and multilateral laws, policies, and guidance. So you'll notice that a lot of it is aligned with the ILO or is aligned with the certs and ratings, certification and rating social responsibility framework. So there's a lot in there that comes from really good normative references from, you know, the small scale fishing guidelines. There's a lot in there. And then in addition to all of those normative documents that went into the development of the framework, it also went through a rigorous stakeholder engagement process. So a number of human rights organizations were consulted in the development of this tool. A number of different NGOs in the space were consulted as well. So there was a lot of input that went into what you see today as the SRA. So just want to spend a little bit of time talking about the value of the SRA. I touched on a little bit of this in the last slide, but just to really emphasize its role in the seafood industry. So first and foremost, the SRA tool is designed as a framework to be applied using a worker-driven approach, which is an effective tool to implement a process designed to improve the well-being of workers, fishers, and farmers. So ultimately, the approach taken in terms of, all the worker-driven elements that I was training on yesterday, and how it's really focused on the workers and their rights. It's a really good, effective tool to implement to ultimately uncover, and then improve areas to improve the overall well-being of workers, fishers, and farmers that are affected. It's an open access framework, so it enables flexibility and implementation, like I mentioned before. So users can design a full assessment program and design what to do with the results. Then as well, like I said, it's not a pass-fail, it's indicating risk. So it's a different way to look at results. So whereby an audit, you'll say, okay, they were non-compliant for this one, let's work with that. You can better understand risk and say, okay, well, they were non-compliant with this, so they're at a high risk of child labor because they didn't meet this, or they're at a high risk of discrimination because they didn't meet this. And so it helps to take it kind of one step further and translate that checklist into something that can, the results can be used in a really valuable way. So, for example, if you look at something that mirrors this in the environmental space, this would be like the Seafood Watch, ratings. So you have like the red, yellow, green level based on the environmental indicators. So it's a really easy way for people to kind of look at the results and interpret them. Again, because it's not a certification, it was designed to be an open access framework to unify the seafood space around a common definition of social responsibility. So what that means is that this can kind of be used as a framework that covers everything, whereas a certification is generally really focused on the area that they've chosen to be. And that's very intentional, and that has a very important space in the industry. But the SRA, because it's not a certification, was able to kind of include everything that a certification might be tentative to include in their program. So it just kind of has everything all under one, versus certifications that might cover pillar 1 or pillar 2 only, or something like that. The SRA is a core function of a holistic human rights due diligence program. So if you think about the assessment stage is really key to human rights due diligence program. So using this framework to kind of build your human rights due diligence process off of can be a really valuable tool. And then last but not least, the SRA can actually act very complementary to other tools that are being implemented. And it can also help to translate and standardize assessments to then convert them into an actionable risk level. So if you have multiple standards, let's say you're a supplier and you have, or an exporter, and you have, one supplier that's fair trade certified and one that's RFES certified, and you just, accept everyone, but you don't really understand, how those compare to one another. You can distill that into their risk levels and figure out, what does this mean across the board? It can also help you to design a strategy around it and kind of distill information from different places into one kind of standardized place. The human rights risk drivers in the fishing industry. So we all have this context going into it. So first and foremost, IUU fishing is linked to both negative environmental impacts and human rights and labor violations. So where there's IUU, there's commonly also human rights abuse is prevalent, and we know that IUU is a very big issue in the fishing industry. So we can kind of understand that there's going to be challenges around human rights when it comes to the issues of IUU. Flags of convenience can also be really tricky because they can exacerbate the lack of transparency in the industry and also make laws very difficult to enforce. So, flags of convenience permit a system of lack of accountability, as it makes identifying and sanctioning fishing vessels and their owners very difficult. So this can add that added level because you can have a boat, you can find everything going wrong, but you might not be able to do anything about it. Of course, transshipment is always an added level of complexity in fishing supply chains. And really the risk there is just that these vessels are out at sea for, most of the year. They're out there far from view of enforcement of any kind. And there's been a lot of known cases where transshipment vessels have been an issue for human rights abuses as well. And then last but not least, migrant workers. So many of you here probably know that the fishing industry has a lot of migrant labor in it. So generally speaking, it's something to be really cognizant of. And in particular, migrant labor is really prevalent, especially in the fishing context, whereby they're looking to reduce costs. For example, migrant labor sometimes is the answer to that. So if a fishery has been depleted environmentally and a fishing vessel needs to, break even, they might start to cut costs on labor. And a good way to do that generally is to move to migrant labor because it tends to be cheaper. But that in its own is a risk. Procurement of migrant labor can be a risk, and those fishers are really, really vulnerable in supply chains. So inherently, there's going to be a high risk of this in the fishing industry because there's a lot of migrant labor that's present. So really, we're just going to jump in here with Principle 1 in the SRA. So if you're familiar, when we went through the 3 pillars of the Monterey Framework today, Principle 1 is based off the first pillar, which is protect human rights, dignity, and access to resources. And these are the performance indicators that it encompasses. So really, like I said, focused on the ILO core conventions and these base individual human rights. There's also then with access rights, a little more on the collective rights, but generally speaking, these are all kind of your core human rights. So before I get into the content on this particular indicator, I just want to frame how each of these slides is built out. So for each indicator, I have some key context and kind of the extra areas. But in this table here that has all of these boxes, this is what essentially the PASGs cover. And this bar on the end here is going from yellow to green to demonstrate how the PISG risk level is changing through these requirements. So similarly to how we discussed yesterday in the framework of the SRA, the medium risk indicators tend to be those that are outcome based and are largely based on legal minimums and generally speaking, just kind of the baseline. And then the green level tends to be more proactive, process based, risk mitigation, and or more difficult outcomes. So I'll try to pinpoint some key areas through each of the indicators here. So starting off with 1.1.1, abuse and harassment. First, just going over some of the key definitions here that are covered under this section. So there's physical abuse, verbal harassment, psychological harassment, and sexual harassment are kind of the first 4 key components to understand here. So physical abuse is contact with the intent to injure or intimidate. Can also include disciplinary measures that cause physical discomfort. Verbal abuse or verbal harassment is the constant use of implied or direct threats versus psychological harassment, which can be a little more convoluted in that it's, humiliating or intimidating, and it can be verbal or non-verbal behavior. And then sexual harassment is, gestures, language, and physical contact that's sexually intimidating, abusive, or exploitative. And then 2 other items that are covered under abuse and harassment here are excessive or abusive disciplinary action. So that's, obviously consequences to actions that are taken that tend to be disproportionate to the action that happened. So it's really important in order to avoid the potential for people to be abused or harassed in the workplace to have really rigid disciplinary procedures so that there's clear instruction to managers on how to handle different situations. And then gender-based violence. So that's, violence directed at someone based on their gender. It affects both men and women, but the majority of the victims are women and girls, as the violence is actually often rooted in power inequality between men and women. So that's where it tends to come from. So in terms of the actual assessment, like I said, it's very outcome based, making sure migrant status isn't used as a threat or tool of coercion, making sure that none of these are taking place. This also includes forced drug use. This is also a form of abuse or harassment. And then as you get into kind of the green level, we're looking for, anti-harassment policies and procedures and disciplinary procedures to really clearly outline what kind of behavior is not accepted by managers, and also that managers understand very clearly what an appropriate disciplinary response is in certain systems. And then while there is a whole indicator on grievance mechanisms in the SRA, um, this here in 1.1.1, there's an indicator making sure that workers, fishers, and farmers can report grievances without fear of retaliation. And that fear of retaliation is really important because that retaliation usually falls under some form of abuse or physical or abuse or harassment. Moving on here to 112A, human trafficking and forced labor. So by definition, forced labor is all work or service which is exacted from any person under the menace of penalty and for which said person has not offered himself or herself voluntarily. So breaking this down into kind of two key components here. First and foremost, looking at menace of any penalty. And there's three kind of bucket items here that this can fall under. So you have coercion, harassment and abuse, which we just went over, and fear of loss, harm to self or family. And so coercion can take many forms. Debt bondage falls under a form of coercion because it's being misleading about, okay, well, you owe me a certain amount of money that you'll never be able to pay back. So in a way that is coercing someone to remain employed under against their will. And then this can go, in a lot of different forms. So, withholding valuable documents. So a passport if someone can't return home to a different country, restriction on workers' movements, withholding of wages or benefits, threat of retaliation, and then denunciation to authority. So all of these are tools that are used by an employer to coerce a worker to remain in employment that they might not want to stay in. And then fear of loss, harm to self or family. So this is really, pinpointing vulnerable areas of a worker's being. So, saying threatening family members or threatening that they'll never see them again, and these kinds of things as a tool to keep people happy and saying, we'll keep your family safe if you stay here and you never leave. So the second part here is has not offered himself or herself voluntarily. So this voluntary aspect to employment is really key here. So there's three different components here as well. First and foremost is for those migrant workers or even domestic migrant workers that use the recruitment route. So unfree recruitment is a really common issue area with human trafficking and forced labor, and this can take a lot of forms as well. So this can either be, a worker performing a job that's different in nature from that they thought they were signing up for, but it can also be as extreme as physical abduction or kidnapping. Life or work under duress. So things like excessive work hours, involuntary overtime, limitations on freedom of movement. So this can even include, the vessel being out at sea for several days, coming back to port, but not being able to leave the boat when it's at port. Working with very low or no wages. And then, of course, there's also impossibility of leaving the employer. So, threatening a risk to the worker if they try to quit, basically. So saying, you're stuck here. There's no way that you can terminate your contract. And oftentimes this is combined with something like debt bondage, saying, okay, well, you're not allowed to terminate your contract because you still owe me money. So these kind of all work in conjunction with one another to create really unsafe potential conditions for workers. So as you might have noticed as I was going through a lot of those components, a lot of the areas that can indicate risk of forced labor are actually really aligned with some of the other risk areas that are covered in other indicators in the SRA. And this is also very aligned with the ILO 11 indicators of forced labor. So as an assessor, there's some kinds of causal or not causal relationships, but there could be connections between two things that might seem seemingly unrelated. So if you think of things like overtime, depending on the conditions of the overtime, it could be indicative of a forced labor situation. And then looking at things like, the harassment and abuse that we just talked about, debt bondage, withholding of wages. So there's a lot of different kinds of indicators that aren't, just directly this person is working in, a job that they don't want to be in. So just being, cognizant of that as an assessor. So when you see some of those other indicators, possibly in your interviews on other topic areas, you might want to focus a little more and see if there's anything here, if there's a risk to human trafficking and forced labor. So the first thing before going into these indicator or PISGs here, when it comes to the applicability, I think this is one that people get really confused on between 112A and 112B. So the question here is the farm or fishery industrial or medium in scale with labor recruitment from other countries and or contracts with employers likely? So what this really is getting at the employee-employer relationship, because human trafficking and forced labor in this sense, and the way that it's described in this indicator, is really between an employer and an employee. And so in a small scale fishery with, owner operator vessels, this is, a much lower risk area. And the next indicator, 112B, is actually more appropriate for small scale fisheries. And so I'll talk about that in a second. As you might notice down here, 112A is titled human trafficking and forced labor, and 112B is titled debt bondage and small scale fisheries. I don't want this to be confused. I don't want people to be confused into thinking that debt bondage isn't covered for employed workers. So under this indicator here, 112A, employed workers are still protected and should not be subject to debt bondage. So I just want to make that really clear that debt bondage can happen in both situations, but I'll talk a little bit more about what it looks like for small scale fisheries in 112B versus what it looks like in 112A here. So when it comes to the assessment, like I said, in the medium risk level, you're really just looking to see if there's any instances or occurrence of forced labor that could indicate that there's a risk there. So whether or not there's any form of human trafficking, whether they're allowed freedom of movement, so free to leave the vessel when it's at port, free to leave the farm, etc. Here, not required to pay a deposit, so debt bondage. That there's legal right to work for workers, because that can put them at really high risk if they don't have that legal protection as an employee of an employer. So that's a really important way to mitigate risk for these workers. And also, of course, making sure that the farm or facility or fishery is only using legally registered recruiters, if they're using recruiters at all. So that's kind of the best way to just make sure and do your due diligence ahead of time. And then you can take that a step further when we look in the green level here, that there's a system in place to actually monitor the use of recruitment agencies. So actually evaluating and see how are we doing against that. So if we think about the systems approach here, this would be on the effectiveness side of the systems approach. And then this covers a lot of other things like a mitigation policy, making sure that workers are paid at least monthly. This is an outcome-based PISG, but it does fall in the green level, simply because this can actually be a really challenging thing for vessels that are out at sea for really long periods of time. So this one could take a little bit more effort, but this is a really important one because of the risk area of debt bondage there. Being able to pay on a regular schedule is really important to help mitigate risks. So like I said, the sister requirement here in 112 is 112B. It's titled debt bondage, and in small scale fisheries, I think is how it's officially listed in the SRA. But individual operators in small scale fisheries, although they're not actually bound to an employer, they can still incur debt with a cooperative or a middleman in seafood supply chains. So the scope of this issue isn't super well understood, but there has been a lot of evidence lately in terms of research that suggests that this actually is a pretty widespread issue in the industry. So there's a couple things here that should be investigated in relation to debt bondage. So this is first and foremost whether or not the fishers or farmers are actually paying off any loans. If they're not paying off any loans to a middleman or a cooperative, then obviously there's no risk there. But if they are paying off, then you have to look at a couple things about those terms, because it's not necessarily that they shouldn't be, taking out loans. There just needs to be fair terms around it to make sure that the fisher's livelihood is not compromised. So then what you're going to be looking for is the extent to which they are indebted and the terms of repayment. So if they owe an inexorbitant amount of money that they'll never hope to pay back, especially at the prices that a middleman or cooperative is offering to them, then that's a really unfair situation and doesn't make a lot of sense. And then the terms of repayment are also very important because they shouldn't be increasing over time. It should be consistent, and there should be clear terms about repayment that have been agreed by both parties. And then the last thing to look at is the rate at which debts are accumulating. So they should not be increasing at an increasing rate, basically. So some of the key indicators to look for in terms of the PISGs, first and foremost, is just are workers, fishers, and farmers allowed to witness product being weighed? If they're able to witness it, they have a better idea of how the pricing works for the product that they're providing, and they can start doing their own mental accounting at the very least. So it's really important that they have transparency in the price that they're being offered for the amount that they're catching. Again, like I said, whether or not they're paying off any debts. So obviously, if they're not paying off any debts, then it's a much lower risk. And then if they are paying off debts, just keeping them stable, and that there's evidence that shows that it's decreasing over time. It's also really important to understand the power dynamics of the fishery when you're working with them, to understand the risks of debt bondage, because if you have this really imbalanced power between the middlemen and the fishers, you can put them in a really compromising position where fishers feel really bound to a certain buyer, and they feel that their flexibility in terms of their business is kind of hindered because of some of these issues of debt bondage. So it's really good to kind of go in with that context and understanding of what those dynamics look like in the fishery. Okay, so moving on here with 113, child labor. So this is one of the indicators that's applicable irregardless of any other characteristics of the fishery. So it's to be applied universally when you're doing an SRA. So child labor is defined as work performed by children, which interferes with a child's right to health, growth, development, and access to quality education. So usually here you're going to be looking largely at secondary research or secondary data collection sources in terms of looking at international laws and policies. In terms of international laws, we're looking at the ILO for guidance here. And so for land-based work, the ILO states that 15 years old should be the minimum age for work. However, ILO C-188, which is the convention specific to fishing activity, states that, on vessels, fishers should not be below the age of 16, just because of the inherent dangerous nature of the fishing industry. And then furthermore, the ILO says that migrant workers should not be younger than 18 years of age. I think there's inherent risks with migrating for work, and in particular for younger children. So 18 is kind of the recommended age there for migrant workers. So in the SRA, I mean, first and foremost, outcome-based, looking at whether or not there is any child labor, but also in particular hazardous child labor, which is the most egregious form. So this is children working in really unsafe conditions. And then when you get to the green level, some of the desk research comes into play here, the secondary data sources. So looking at, whether or not there's a sectoral risk of child labor. And if that is the case, in the desk research, there should be a good policy in place that also includes a remediation plan, as well as root cause analysis and risk mitigation procedures. So if a child was fined, or if you found on site, or if there is a sectoral risk, those pressures are going to be there. So you should be being very proactive about the strategies that you have in place. And then, of course, ongoing performance monitoring. So again, systems approach. Here we're looking at both the intent and the effectiveness when we're looking at the green level, and then the medium risk level is more focused on the implementation. It's also recommended in accordance with human rights or human subjects research protocols that assessors don't directly interview minors or children, so people under the age of 18. The other thing to mention that's important here in the SRA is that in order to recognize that in small-scale fishing communities, it's very common that children will help with their family on board vessels below the age of 15. So the SRA recognizes that this is a reality, and so there's an indicator or PISG here about children below the legal age that are working with family members are allowed to do so as long as it's not interfering with compulsory schooling. and as long as it's not harmful to their health and development. So it really should be light work only, and it should be with a family member. So next year we have 114, which is centered around freedom of association and collective bargaining. So some of the benefits to having, these mechanisms in place and these rights in place for workers is, it addresses power imbalances. Collective bargaining, allows workers to raise issues through a union that affect a large group. So it's really powerful to come as a group with, many people who are experiencing the same issue. It also allows for direct resolution. So instead of bringing in a third party or letting things get too far, you can kind of deal with issues internally. And then also advocacy. So trade unions have a really important role in driving legislation forward in relation to workers' rights. So by definition, freedom of association is that all workers, fishers, and farmers have the right to establish and join organizations, elect their organizational leader, and develop their own rules and guidelines without interference or intimidation from the employer. And then collective bargaining is kind of an extension of that, whereby fishers, farmers, and workers have the right to collective bargaining. So that's allowing them to negotiate with their employer as a group for better working conditions or amendments to their terms of employment and pay. So in a lot of places, you'll see a collective bargaining agreement whereby workers have advocated together, have band together and advocated for certain terms that employers have agreed to and are legally binding. So in terms of assessment here, it's really just, making sure that they have the freedom to join workers' organizations without interference from the employer. The SRA also, in order to actually demonstrate, at least a medium risk in this area, the SRA is looking to see whether or not there are laws for freedom of association in the area where the SRA is being implemented. So that's one thing to note as well. There are also some areas where human rights defenders are actively suppressed. So the SRA is trying to make sure that it's operating in an area that is, collaborative with trade unions. And then also kind of on the medium level here, just making sure that there's no discrimination for participating in workers' organizations, because sometimes those workers, because they're often kind of creating a ruckus and creating problems potentially for the employer, you might find that those workers are retaliated against. So it's really making sure that those workers who have decided to use their freedom to join a workers' organization are not treated any differently and are not retaliated against for their involvement. Then when we get kind of to the risk mitigation here in the green level, making sure that there's a policy and procedure that's clearly communicated to workers about their rights to freedom of association and collective bargaining, making sure as well that workers are trained by a third party on their rights to freedom of association. So not internally, there should be, a trade union or a workers organization that comes in and conducts this training for workers. And then importantly, that women are participating in unions commensurate with their representation, because as we mentioned a couple times already, but women might have a very, very different experience and might have very different problems to men in the workplace. In particular, if you have, a culture of sexual harassment in an industry where it's primarily the victims are women, those egregious issues might not be raised if the women aren't well represented in these kinds of organizations. So having them as part of it makes sure that you're addressing all of the issues and experiences that people might have in the workplace. So next year we have 115, wages and benefits. So workers, fishers, and farmers have the right to remuneration that will provide them with a decent life. And so most countries you'll have what's known as the minimum wage. And this is, the indication of the minimum that workers should be paid. Although, the minimum wage is commonly used by most companies, as our knowledge of the actual cost of living broadens, many are now looking to define and move more towards a living wage, which tends to be a little bit higher than the minimum wage because it includes things like, access to food for your entire family, healthcare, education. It has a number of different indicators that go into that calculation that are really trying to get at the true cost of living rather than just surviving, I guess is the way to put it. In terms of applicability, it's important to check whether or not the workers or farmers are wage workers. If you're working in a fishery where there's hired labor workers operating with a payment share system, the guidance here is a little bit more fuzzy. So please, I would actually encourage you in that case, if you're having some confusion, to reach out to me. But I know in a lot of areas there might be laws that protect payment share to at least earn the minimum wage, and then the payment share is plus or minus whatever they catch that day. Or there could be, other, specific agreements around payment shares. Some people on this call might actually be more experts in this area than myself, but I know that this terminology here, just saying whether or not the workers are waged, can be somewhat dismissive and confusing. So if if that's the case for a fishery that you're working in with a payment share system and it's an employed worker, then please do reach out with any questions. For small scale fisheries and individual operators, it's if they have, crew on board, 90% of the time it's going to be payment share, right? And so this is kind of a different situation, but really focused on waged workers here and those that are protected under our contract as well. So when it comes to minimum wage, first and foremost, outcome-based, looking at minimum, whether or not there are minimum legal requirements. So is there a defined minimum wage by law? If not, you're going to be in a higher risk area, because then workers theoretically could be working for nothing if there's no floor. So really looking at those laws, making sure there's equal remuneration for men and women, that wages and benefits are meeting the minimum wages in accordance with law. And then, of course, that overtime wages are meeting minimum legal requirements. So oftentimes anything over a certain number of hours is offered at a premium rate. Commonly, this is anything over 48 hours. In some areas, it's defined differently, though. So make sure that in your desk research, you look up overtime laws to make sure you have a good understanding of whether or not workers are entitled to a premium rate for overtime hours. It's also important here to make sure that deductions to wages are not used as a form of discipline. So there will likely be deductions on wages that are standard practice, things like taxes, for example, as a deduction to your wages. So it's really important here is just that workers, if there are deductions on their wages, that they understand what they're being paid for. For example, some that, live in worker housing might be paying for something. If they're, getting food or whatever, there might be different deductions there, but workers need to understand those. They need to be transparent, and they still need to be earning enough to afford all of those things. Of course, making sure as well that employers are legally contracting employees so that they're protected under that contract legally. And then when it comes to kind of these risk mitigation factors, it's anything that goes above and beyond. So if you're approaching a living wage, if you're paying more than the minimum wage, obviously that's going to be a lower risk. And then as well, that there's a collaborative, engagement with workers about how you can improve wages in mutually beneficial ways. So this could be, let's talk about more efficient production and how we can sell the same product for the same price, but with fewer inputs or whatever it might be, and have some really conducive conversations conducive of progress there when it comes to wages. And then for the fishing reality, you'll have fishers in industrial scale fisheries that are out at sea for 30 days plus. And if they are the primary carer for their family, and primary earner for their family, the best way to make sure that this wage is going where it needs to go is to have some mechanism to allow workers to transmit their pay to their families on shore, and then doing this as well at no cost and no transaction fees or anything like that. This can take a lot of forms, but this is a really good way to make sure that, like I said, the families of those that are working are protected. So the next one here is 116, adequate rest. So naturally in the fishing industry, especially wild capture, there could be kind of irregular circumstances on vessels that can lead to really unstructured work. So it's not like a processing facility where everyone has shifts, they show up certain days, etc. So it's not as structured as that. However, there generally will be some kind of shift structure, hopefully. So generally speaking, fishers can then be expected to work long hours to make sure that fish is preserved properly, and that, at the moments that are where everyone's needed, everyone kind of bands together at these peak fishing hours and times. The problem and the risks with working hours really pose a really important risk to worker health in particular, because there's evidence to suggest that those that are operating, especially dangerous machinery or in dangerous conditions, like out at sea in waves that are throwing you around. If you're not well rested and you're more conducive, it's more conducive to making mistakes and for accidents to happen. So a well rested worker is really important. And then as well, fishing is a really physically demanding job. So someone who's unable to physically perform might not be able to keep themselves out of danger if they're overly exhausted. So it really is a health risk to the individual and to their peers who are relying on them to do their job. So it's really important to take that into consideration, although I know it can be really challenging on fishing vessels, first and foremost, to actually enforce this, but then to also monitor it. So really trying our best here to find the ways that we can improve these conditions for workers. So the ILO C-188, once again, this is the convention related to work on vessels. This is kind of the guidance that they have here. So it's mostly focused on rest, hours of rest rather than hours of work, which is kind of opposite than what it is for manufacturing. So it's 10 hours of rest in any 24-hour period. So that's a 14-hour day roughly, but it could be split up throughout the day. So it's just 10 hours of rest total in a 24-hour period, and then 77 hours rest in any 7-day period. So that's theoretically 11 hours a day. So within those two, kind of understanding how you can be creative with the shifts to try to get workers enough time to rest. So in assessment, what you're really looking for here then in terms of risk, first and foremost, is those thresholds. So in terms of outcome, you're looking to see, is this happening? Is this possible for workers? But then also checking whether or not there actually is a mechanism for workers to track their hours. Because step one to understanding whether or not there's risks associated with working hours is to know the hours that people are working. So there needs to be some kind of mechanism in place to adequately assess risk. Also making sure that legal minimum requirements are being implemented. So whether that's hourly and or pay related to working hours. This is making sure as well that overtime is voluntary. So this can be a little tricky on vessels as well, because sometimes there's emergencies or issues where, it's not necessarily voluntary, but you have to just do it. So there's two different things though, because there's that, and then there's also being forced to work for 20 hours in a day. And so your job as an assessor is to understand how frequent is it that this person is working excessive hours? Is it on an exceptional basis? What are the circumstances under which they're doing this? So yeah, your job to really kind of evaluate the risk there as an assessor. There's also, because the SRA is applicable to onshore work as well, when you get to the green area or the green risk level for onshore, it really is just following the ILO core convention. So 48 hours a week, 48 hours a week total, and then a total of 6 days per week. So 1 day off within a 7-day period. And that's 24 hours consecutively for the onshore workers. And then the last one here to point out in particular is that there's a system in place to anticipate peak production needs. I think I talked about this a little bit yesterday, but one of the key areas that could be an issue is that if you're constantly having excessive overtime with your workers, it's possible that you might just need to hire more people because you're ill-staffed, or that your shift schedules are not conducive of the work. So there should be some kind of proactive means to assess, how are we doing? How are our workers doing during these peak times? Like, do we feel like we're adequately staffed? And so this kind of falls, if you look at the systems approach, once again, in the effectiveness category. So it's really being managing and looking at your how you're doing in relation to working hours. And then, of course, maternity and paternity leave. In particular, we think about maternity leave for women, they need enough time to rest afterwards to make sure that they're healthy to work. But this is kind of like the highest level of risk mitigation here in terms of rest, is just having maternity and paternity leave and compensating during that time. Okay, so next is 117A, access to basic services. So in terms of applicability, this is applicable if the fishery or farm provides worker housing or requires live aboard vessel time. So obviously, if that's not a requirement, if it's just a day trip, you don't have to score this indicator. But if it is the case, then the indicator does need to be scored. Well, if no, then it's 112B as well, which we'll talk about in just a second here. So substandard living conditions on vessels is really, really common in the fishing industry. And that's even despite the fact that food and lodging can often be deducted from wages. So workers are theoretically paying for these kind of subpar conditions. And so the what we're looking for here in terms of the state of the vessel is that it's safe, well maintained, sufficient in size and number for the crew on board, and that there's also access to potable drinking water and food that provides sufficient nutritional value. So when we look at the actual assessment here in terms of outcome based, it's really trying to make sure that there's adequate fire prevention, air ventilation, that legal minimums are met, and that there's just a reasonable level of safety, decency, hygiene, and comfort. So a little bit of this is subjective, but should be kind of commensurate of the size of the vessel, of the type of fishery that it is, of a number of different factors there. Same with sanitary facilities. They should be adequate and appropriate based on the vessel size, making sure that there's always potable water. So in particular, even for, those for smaller boats where it's a little unconventional. So just, it might take very different forms. A very big, sophisticated industrial scale vessel should have like a proper pumping system versus a smaller vessel that might have a more informal version, but just making sure that sanitary facilities and potable water are accessible. And then as you get into the green level indicators, it's kind of these higher level of decency and privacy. So things that are making sure that men and women have separate sleeping quarters and facilities. So adding that level of comfort and privacy. And making sure as well that sleeping quarters and sanitation facilities are not locked from the outside. This can be a really big, on boats, I'm sure many of you have spent time on vessels. And as you know, a lot of the time the doors latch so that you're not flying around while you're at sea. So it's just making sure that any of those provisions that are in place are not locking someone in potentially. That could be a hazard in terms of, an emergency taking place, or it could also be an issue for things like it's a place where you could lock someone in terms of freedom of movement, and forced labor situations, and abuse and harassment, of course. So all of these work together. The other thing too is just having, when we think about the SRA as a worker-driven approach here, we're looking at things like whether or not workers, representatives and management are meeting to discuss vessel or housing improvements. So just being really proactive about, okay, here's the reality of the vessel, here's what we have, and here's what we can do to offer a better level of comfort. So it's a really collaborative conversation between workers and management about what's feasible on management side and the main, issues and potential safety issues that people are having during their time on the vessel. So just to elaborate a little bit more about what safe, well-maintained, and sufficient in size and number kind of really refers to here, looking at guidance from the ILO. So first and foremost, that there's approval plans for the construction or modification of fishing vessels, that the maintenance of the accommodation and galley spaces has due regard for hygiene and overall safe, healthy, and comfortable conditions. So really just kind of walking in there and saying, okay, how do I feel about this place? And then in your worker interviews, having an understanding of things like, well, do you see rats all the time? Or is it really dirty? Does it really smell terrible 100% of the time? So just general comfort and hygiene things to make the workers feel more comfortable while they're out at sea. Although being on a vessel, it can be really challenging to be, it's not a luxury cruise, right? So it's a difficult balance to strike, but being reasonable with, making sure that there's some level of comfort for the workers, because that's a decency and dignity thing for the workers. Of course, ventilation, heating, cooling, lighting. So that's for worker safety as well as fire prevention. Mitigation of excessive noise and vibration, again, another level of comfort. That the location, size, and construction materials of furnishing the sleeping rooms and the mess rooms or other accommodation spaces are of good quality. And then, the other two that we talked about with sanitation facilities that offer privacy, hot and cold water, and procedures for responding to complaints concerning accommodations. So having that collaborative conversation with management, between management and workers on the conditions on a vessel. The 117B, this is applicable if there isn't a liveaboard vessel. So this is for, the target here is then focusing on the communities, and this is targeted for small scale fisheries. So in order to improve the overall well-being of workers, the conditions of their community can be assessed as part of the SRA. So for small scale fisheries, this is of a lot of importance because they're operating their own vessels and they're ultimately providing for their communities as well. So in the assessment, it's looking for these 4 key components. It's whether or not there's access to potable water in the community, access to electricity, sewage, and waste. And so these are all kind of indicators of a level of development of a community and can offer, comforts and dignity and decency to the people who are living in those communities. So this one's a little bit broader. And in terms of application, if you still have questions about what this might look like, in a lot of cases, primary data collection just means walking around in the community and then during worker interviews, asking questions on this. But, I think one of the more effective ways is to ask this question as part of a survey with community members and fishers that are living in the community to try to get kind of a broader understanding. And this can be paired with some of the ones in Principle 3, depending on the structure of your assessment, noting as well that a survey-based fully SRA isn't recommended and not allowed for fishery improvement projects, but is still a very useful tool for these broader community targeted indicators. Okay, so continuing on where we left off, we're almost done with Principle 1 here, at least almost done in particular with component 1.1. So first and foremost, we're now continuing on with 1.18, which is occupational health and safety. So I'm sure as many of you know that fishing is probably actually declared as one of the most dangerous industries in the world. Injury is very common and deaths occur often as well. So there should be procedures and controls in place to ensure that fishers can do their job safely and that there's proper due diligence taken by an employer to reduce the likelihood of loss of life or limb. And so in general and under the SRA, in terms of looking at this from a risk perspective, there's proactive approaches and reactive approaches. And so reactive approaches are really centered on, recording accidents and then actually looking at the next indicator, medical response, is actually also kind of a reactive approach to mitigating some of the impacts of occupational health and safety. But then also reactive is things like complying with laws and then also having good communication equipment. And then proactive things, there's a lot of steps that employers should take to make sure that they've done their due diligence to keep workers safe. So this is first and foremost understanding, assessing, and mitigating risks proactively. Developing policies and procedures on health and safety, making sure fishers are trained, having warning signs in dangerous areas, and then of course the provision of personal protective equipment is an important proactive step to take. So in the assessment, first and foremost, looking at making sure that there's access to communication equipment, which is really important. For a number of reasons in relation to health and safety, but making sure reaction time can be really quick and that there's good communication, especially on a large industrial vessel internally on the boat, and then also to land as well. Making sure that PPE is provided to workers and in particular at no cost. In the SRA, it also covers maintenance of PPE and then replacement of PPE. So at any point, if PPE is compromised, is not going to be able to keep the worker safe. So it still is the employer's responsibility to make sure that there's PPE provided. And then what you'll notice is that in a lot of other indicators, training for fishers and managers is actually found in the green level indicators. Because health and safety, it really is kind of a base level expectation. There is kind of this expectation here that in order to actually mitigate occupational health and safety risks, that there has been a training for workers and management on, policies and procedures around health and safety. Making sure you're following national laws, et cetera. And then, of course, having formal channels of communication between workers, fishers, and farmers and management to discuss and implement health and safety procedures. So workers will be the ones that will understand the dangers the best. And they'll also be the ones that understand what they need to make their jobs safer. And so having that direct line of communication is really, really valuable, especially for a worker-driven approach here. So there's a number of other indicators here. A lot of them, again, are outcome-based. Other ones are more process-based, like having a health and safety policy. And then, of course, having special protections for young, pregnant, or vulnerable workers as well. And then in relation there, next we have 119, which is medical response. So when or if an accident does happen, there needs to be really good medical response, in particular for vessels that are out at sea. There are a lot of cases where you'll be 2 days from shore and you'll have somebody who's injured in a critical way. And depending on the medical response that you have available to workers, it could mean the difference between life and death. So it's really important to be mitigating or to have provisions in place to demonstrate a low risk level here when it comes to the effect that these accidents can have on workers if a medical response hasn't been well thought out. So in this section of the SRA, there is an applicability, but the only key qualifier here is vessel length. So whereas none of the other indicators talk about vessel length or anything as like an industrial versus small scale fishery, this section focuses on two key variables. The first is vessels that are 24 meters or greater and vessels that undertake longer trips. So that's defined as 3 or more days. So in the SRA, it's looking that there's adequate medical supplies. And here the term adequate was used very intentionally because what that word means will vary depending on the fishery. So for this one, only in the PISGs that specify the 24 meters versus the 3 days, that's where it's applicable. So for example, I think there's 7 or 8 PISGs in this indicator. And actually I can just show you, I think this is the easiest way to make sure it's well understood. I thought I had it. I just had it open. 2 seconds here. I just want to make this applicability clear because we've had confusion in other places. So when we look at the actual SRA, I'll zoom in a little as well. So in brackets here, what you'll see are the PASGs and where it is applicable. So for S2 here, this is only for long trips, so those greater than 3 days. And then here you have one for vessels that are greater than 24 meters. But for the rest, unless otherwise specified, it's applicable to everyone in the same way. So hopefully that's clear. I know it's a little different than the others in terms of applicability. So yeah, we're looking for, again, adequate, and then making sure there's a trained first responder. So this is someone who is explicitly trained in first aid, and again, should be commensurate of the vessel and the realities of the kinds of accidents they'll have to respond to. Also, for those vessels that are going for longer trips, having a medical certificate, this is really common practice, and in a lot of cases is the law. So just making sure that the workers have a valid medical certificate attesting to their fitness to work. And then as well in the green level, just making sure that the provision of medical care is coming at the expense of the employer, and that workers that are injured are repatriated. Migrant workers, for example, are repatriated if necessary at the employer's expense. So if they're unable to continue doing the activities that have been asked of them and they're a migrant worker, they shouldn't be forced to stay on the vessel. They should be repatriated after they can no longer work. Then, of course, there is, in here we talk about workers' compensation as well. This isn't always guaranteed by law. So the SRA is saying the lowest risk level here is that worker compensation is offered irregardless of what the law has stipulated. And then also in the green level here is that every worker. So if you notice in the medium risk level, this is saying that there is a trained first responder. This doesn't mean that in the green level, where we say workers are trained in emergency first response, that they have to be, a full-on medical responder. But this is saying that all workers have some degree of kind of first aid and emergency response training, so that you can increase the likelihood that someone will be able to adequately deal with accidents that might arise on the vessel and improve probably the medical response time as well. So this is just kind of best case scenario that everyone has a working knowledge of first aid. All right, then we're into component 1.2. So this is, again, access rights. And first and foremost, starting off with customary use rights. So many of the world's remaining areas of high biodiversity and critical ecosystems are lands and waters owned, occupied, and managed by indigenous peoples. So one of the main, human rights that we're talking about here in relation to customary use rights affects indigenous populations in just more strongly. Um, so in many cases, their reliance on natural resources for their livelihoods may increase their vulnerability to adverse impacts of project development. So in particular, what the SRA is really focused on here, first and foremost, is that there is due consultation in terms of free, prior, and informed consent with Indigenous communities. So making sure that there's no coercion, duress, fraud, bribery, intimidation, or manipulation to move a project through. And by project here, I can also mean fishing rights or harvest control measures or things that are put in place in a fishery that is known to be used and that Indigenous communities are reliant on. It's not just Indigenous, it can also be customary users of other different kinds. So it's just understanding those that are reliant on the resource and making sure that they're well informed. So free and prior, of course, so giving enough time and enough notice. You can't just say, oh, in a week we're about to change the fishing requirements, or in a week this is going to change. It should be, okay, we're in the process in the early stages. This might happen in a year from now. So just giving enough prior consent or inform them priorly. And then informed also takes different levels because, for example, there are cases, I know in Canada, we talked about a lot where people would get like a phone call and that 5-minute phone call would then be cited by law as as them informing an entire community of Indigenous people that something was about to happen. So this is something that really needs to be protected in terms of the due effort that has been taken to actually make sure it's meaningful, how these customer users are informed. And then consent. So having them say, okay, I agree to this process. This is in line with, how, I want to interact with this resource. So just making sure that the consent is there and that you're not, taking away the rights of customary users through your actions. So in terms of the unit of assessment, how this affects, the SRA, first and foremost, it's understanding customary use rights so that it's been mapped out, and not that it's only been mapped out by you and yourself, that, it's been mapped out. You say, this is what I think it is. And then here's some of the examples of the other users, and let's have them have input to see if we've done it accurately. Because it's not just about saying, okay, this is my land. It's about saying, this is what I think my land is. What do you think your land is? And I think that's part of the process that's really important. Whether or not, the fishery is actually observing the legal and customary rights of local people. So there often will be laws in place around this that protect the rights of Indigenous peoples and customary users. And this one is very important for fishing industries. So making sure that fishers are not denied or revoked of fishing rights in a discriminatory way. Before I keep going through this as well, one thing I will note is that a lot of the answers to these questions will come from desk research. These won't be direct answers that fishers, for example, might necessarily have answers to. So really focus, the SRA Guide to Data Collection has a lot of really good resources, and really focus your secondary research on this. And potentially in a lot of areas, this might be something where there's a lack of information. So, it's going to be a little bit of a more challenging indicator, but still, very important, and really draw on that guide to data collection for a lot of good information about how to collect data here.